Want to know why? Ask how. Howard, the humongous. Okay, we've had two major Supreme Court decisions come down this week. I was very enthusiastic about the results of both of them. One of them upheld Obamacare, and the other allowed for gay people to get married legitimately. In the arguments, no matter which side of the debate you took on these two issues, your argument was about freedom. What we fail to realize in the United States is that freedom is an artificial concept. It's a great concept. It's a fabulous concept. I wouldn't want to live without the concept, but it is an artificial concept. And not all of us agree on it. Radical Muslims, especially when they take to the streets in London, have signs that say freedom is a lie. Democracy is a lie. What do they mean by that? Well, freedom isn't the only thing that you can seek in life. You can seek duty. You can seek to be a faithful, loyal slave of God or of some other authority figure. And that, in fact, is what some cultures focus on, is duty, loyalty, being a faithful and obedient slave. Now, is there really a difference between societies and individuals who follow freedom and those who feel that duty and responsibility are the two major things you should be concerned about in life, that obedience is the major thing that you can be concerned about, whereas we tend to love rebellion? There is a huge difference. And it starts at the most basic biological level. What is freedom? Freedom is choice. And freedom, you get a sense of how deeply biological freedom is when you look at experiments that were done with rats in the 1960s. In the 1960s, first of all, in the 1950s, executives were getting ulcers. And scientists wanted to understand where those ulcers came from. So they took two monkeys, they rigged them up in basically electric chairs, and started giving them shocks. There was one difference between the two monkeys. One had a button with which it could turn off the shock. The other did not. Now, the hypothesis at the time was executives were getting ulcers because of the stress of having to make decisions. They had a responsibility that their free riders, their laborers, their workers did not have. And it was driving them to a state of physical stress. It was creating the ulcers in their stomachs. That was the theory at the time. So one monkey was called the executive monkey. He was the one with the button who could turn off the shock. The other was, for all practical purposes, the laborer monkey. He did not have a button with which he could turn off the shock, but he got the shock because since the two of them were on the same circuit, the two of them got exactly the same amount of shock at exactly the same time. And when the executive monkey hit the button to turn off the shock, the monkey who was in the passenger seat also was relieved of his pain. What did the researchers discover? Well, at first they wrote up articles that tended to indicate that in fact the executive monkey, the one with all the decision-making responsibility, was the one getting the ulcers. But later those experiments were reviewed and it was discovered that that conclusion was absolutely false. It wasn't the monkey who had his finger on the button who got the ulcers. It was the monkey in the passenger seat who had no control over when he did or did not get a shot. So later experiments were arranged in which two rats their tails were rigged to an electrical line so that they would both get, if the experimenter chose to shock them, they would both get shocks in exactly the same amount at exactly the same time. And again, one rat was given a button with which he could turn off the shock. The other rat was not. Something remarkable happened in the physiology of these two rats. The rat who had a sense of control, who had a sense of choice, who when the pain came on could turn it off, that rat stayed relatively healthy and he stayed cognitively alert. His brain stayed, his mind stayed in good shape. But the rat who had no control, the rat who had no button, deteriorated. He deteriorated physically, he developed ulcers in his skin, his immune system went into a nosedive, his cognitive processes went into an utter and complete mush. And later experiments demonstrated something even more astonishing. If you put two dogs next to each other on the same electrified floor, but the two were in separate cages, and one dog had an off button with which he could turn off the pain, and the other dog did not, sometimes the dog that had no control over his pain, look, both dogs, when the shock hit, leapt. They jumped. You could feel them thudding up against the walls and the ceiling of the cage as they were trying to find an escape. But eventually, in about 20% of the cases, the the dog, the puppy that had no control over his pain whatsoever, lay down on the floor and simply took every single pain. Now, the puppy or the dog in the next cage, who had the button and it could turn things on and off, stayed relatively healthy. The dog who was just laying there and taking it did not. But the most remarkable thing was that if you opened the door of the cage that this poor hapless puppy laying on the floor was laying on, he didn't even try to escape. He simply took pain after pain after pain after pain. That's called learned helplessness. Now, what does this have to do with freedom? Everything, as you're about to see. But first, one more little detail. In some cases in these experiments with rats and dogs, in addition to giving the rat or dog with the control switch alone, they gave a little red warning light that came on immediately before the shock hit. And in some cases, they only gave the little red warning light. They didn't give the button with which you could turn off the pain. But the rat in the neighboring cage or the dog in the neighboring cage had no warning. No warning. Couldn't see the little red light. Well, it turns out that if you give a dog an ability to predict when the pain is coming, he also stays much healthier than a rat that doesn't have a sense of prediction. Modern society is based, secular society, the Western society, the one that believes in freedom, the one that believes in democracy, is based on science. And science idolizes two things: prediction and control. What is freedom? It's having the choice of turning the off button on or turning it off. It's having the ability to predict. That is freedom. In a society in which you are told, with a word like Islam, which means utter and complete submission, that utter and complete submission and simply giving in to your duty to a higher authority figure or a God, if you are told that's your entire mission in life, you are much more likely to be in the position of the rat who gave up and took every shock than in the position of the rat who either had prediction or control or both. So freedom is an artificial concept. It probably began with the Greeks. It probably was expanded by the Romans. Then it was picked up again during the Renaissance and amplified to the concept that we know today. And it is an artificial concept. When you make a decision that you care about freedom, that is a choice. You could also go the radical Islamic way and simply submit and simply give in and simply be a, quote, slave to God. But the odds are that if you believe in freedom and you actually perceive that you have freedom and you actually do have choices in your life, you will be healthier and your mind will be more alert. When you pit two societies up against each other, each of which has roughly 1 billion people, and those people are in a state of mental alertness, are they going to do better than the society in which people are humble, in which people are slaves to their authority figures, in which people focus on duty, not on freedom? Well, that's a good question, because a society that focuses on duty, not freedom, can work in an organized phalanx with much greater discipline, and it can make much greater sacrifices than a society of freedom. But is it worth sacrificing for a society of freedom? Is it worth fighting for freedom? In my opinion, you bet. This is Howard the Humongous speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make, or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for the sleazy, slimy, sneaky, seditious, impossible to find, utterly elusive little off button. I think I've found it.